Chapter 5 of Closing In, Marines in the Seizure of Iwo Jima by Joseph H. Alexander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Drive North. The landing force still had much to learn about its opponent. Senior intelligence officers did not realize until 27 February, the 9th day of the battle, that General Kuribayashi was in fact on Iwo Jima, or that his fighters actually numbered half again the original estimate of 13,000. For Kuribayashi, the unexpectedly early loss of the Suribachi garrison represented a setback, yet he occupied a position of great strength. He still had the equivalent of 8 infantry battalions, a tank regiment, 2 artillery, and 3 heavy mortar battalions, plus the 5,000 gunners and naval infantry under his counterpart, Rear Admiral Toshinosuke Ichimaru. Unlike other besieged garrisons in the Central Pacific, the 2 Japanese services on Iwo Jima functioned well together. Kuribayashi was particularly pleased with the quality of his artillery and engineering troops. Colonel Chisaku Kaido served as the chief of artillery from his seemingly impregnable concrete blockhouse on a promontory on the east-central sector of the Motoyama Plateau, a lethal landmark the Marines soon dubbed Turkey Knob. Major General Sadasu Senda, a former artillery officer with combat experience in China and Manchuria, commanded the 2nd Independent Mixed Brigade, whose main units would soon be locked into a 25-day death struggle with the 4th Marine Division. Kuribayashi knew that the 204th Naval Construction Battalion had built some of the most daunting defensive systems on the island in that sector. One cave had a tunnel 800 feet long with 14 separate exits. It was one of hundreds designed to be defended in depth. The Japanese defenders waiting for the advance of the 5 Amphibious Corps were well armed and confident. Occasionally, Kuribayashi authorized company-sized spoiling attacks to recapture lost terrain or disrupt enemy assault preparations. These were not suicidal or sacrificial. Most were preceded by stinging artillery and mortar fires and aimed at limited objectives. Kuribayashi's iron will kept his troops from large-scale, wasteful banzai attacks until the last days. One exception occurred the night of 8 March when General Senda grew so frustrated at the tightening noose being applied by the 4th Marine Division that he led 800 of his surviving troops in a ferocious counterattack. Finally given a multitude of open targets, the Marines cut them down in a lingering melee. For the first week of the drive north, the Japanese on Iwo Jima actually had the attacking Marines outgunned. Japanese 150mm howitzers and 120mm mortars were superior to most of the weapons of the landing force. The Marines found the enemy direct-fire weapons to be equally deadly, especially the dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns and the 47mm tank guns, buried and camouflaged up to their turrets. The Japs could snipe with those big guns, said retired Lieutenant General Don J. Robertson. The defenders also had the advantage of knowing the ground. Not surprisingly, most casualties in the first 3 weeks of the battle resulted from high explosives, mortars, artillery, mines, grenades, and the hellacious rocket bombs. Time correspondent Robert Sherrod reported that the dead at Iwo Jima, both Japanese and American, had one thing in common. They all died with the greatest possible violence. Nowhere in the Pacific War had I seen such badly mangled bodies. Many were cut squarely in half. Close combat was rough enough. On Iwo Jima, the stress seemed endless because for a long time the Marines had no secure rear area in which to give shot-up troop units a respite. Kuribayashi's gunners throughout the Motoyama Plateau could still bracket the beaches and airfields. The enormous spigot mortar shells and rocket bombs still came tumbling out of the sky. Japanese infiltrators were drawn to softer targets in the rear. Anti-personnel mines and booby traps encountered here on a large scale for the first time in the Pacific seemed everywhere. Exhausted troop units would stumble out of the front line seeking nothing more than a helmet full of water in which to bathe and a deep hole in which to sleep. Too often the men had to spend their rare rest periods repairing weapons, humping ammo, dodging major caliber incoming, or having to repel yet another nocturnal Japanese probe. General Schmidt planned to attack the Japanese positions in the north with 3 divisions abreast, the 5th on the left, the 3rd, less the 3rd Marines, in the center, and the 4th on the right, along the east coast. The drive north officially began on D+5, the day after the capture of Suribachi. Prep fires along the high ground immediately north of the 2nd Airfield extended for a full hour. Then 3 regimental combat teams moved out abreast, the 26th Marines on the left, the 24th Marines on the right, and the 21st Marines again in the middle. For this attack, General Schmidt consolidated the Sherman tanks of all 3 divisions into one armored task force commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William R. Rip Collins. It would be the largest concentration of Marine tanks in the war, virtually an armored regiment. The attack plan seemed solid. The Marines soon realized they were now trying to force passage through Kuribayashi's main defensive belt. The well-coordinated attack degenerated into desperate small-unit actions along the front. The 26 Marines on the left, aided by the tanks, gained the most yardage, but it was all relative. The airfield runways proved to be lethal killing zones. Marine tanks were bedeviled by mines and high-velocity direct-fire weapons all along the front. On the right flank, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander A. Vandergrift, Jr., son of the Commandant, became a casualty. Major Doyle A. Stout took command of the 3rd Battalion, 24th Marines. During the fighting on D+5, General Schmidt took leave of Admiral Hill and moved his command post ashore from the amphibious force flagship Auburn, AGC-10. Colonel Howard N. Kenyon led his 9th Marines ashore and into a staging area. With that, General Erskine moved the command post of the 3rd Marine Division ashore. The 21st Marines reverted to its parent command. Erskine's artillery regiment, the 12th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Raymond F. Christ, Jr., continued to land for the next several days. Schmidt now had 8 infantry regiments committed. Holland Smith still retained the 3rd Marines and Expeditionary Troops Reserve. Schmidt made the first of several requests to Smith for release of this seasoned outfit. The 5 Amphibious Corps had already suffered 6,845 casualties. The next day, D+6, 25 February, provided little relief in terms of Japanese resistance. Small groups of Marines accompanied by tanks somehow made it across the runway, each man harboring the inescapable feeling he was alone in the middle of a gigantic bowling alley. Sometimes holding newly gained positions across the runway proved more deadly than the process of getting there. Resupply became nearly impossible. Tanks were invaluable, many were lost. Schmidt this day managed to get on shore the rest of his corps artillery, 2 battalions of 155 mm howitzers under Colonel John S. Letcher. Well-directed fire from these heavier field pieces eased some of the pressure. So did call fire from the cruisers and destroyers assigned to each maneuver unit. But the Marines expressed disappointment in their air support. The 3rd Marine Division complained that the Navy's assignment of 8 fighters and 8 bombers on station was entirely inadequate. By noon on this day, General Cates sent a message to Schmidt requesting that the Strategic Air Force in the Marianas replace the Navy air support immediately. Colonel Vernon E. Meggie, now ashore as Air Commander Iwo Jima and taking some of the heat from frustrated division commanders, blamed those little spit-kit Navy fighters up there trying to help, never enough, never where they should be. In fairness, it is doubtful whether any service could have provided effective air support during the opening days of the drive north. The air liaison parties with each regiment played hell trying to identify and mark targets. The Japanese maintained masterful camouflage. Frontline units were often eyeball to eyeball with the enemy, and their air support request net was overloaded. The Navy squadrons rising from the decks of escort carriers improved thereafter, to the extent that their conflicting missions would permit. Subsequent strikes featured heavier bombs, up to 500 pounds, and improved response time. A week later, General Cates rated his air support entirely satisfactory. The Battle of Iwo Jima, however, would continue to frustrate all providers of supporting arms. The Japanese almost never assembled legitimate targets in the open. The Japs weren't on Iwo Jima, said Captain Fields of the 26 Marines. They were in Iwo Jima. Richard Wheeler, who survived service with the 28th Marines and later wrote 2 engrossing books about the battle, pointed out this phenomenon. This was surely one of the strangest battlefields in history, with one side fighting wholly above the ground and the other operating almost wholly within it. Throughout the battle, American aerial observers marveled at the fact that one side of the field held thousands of figures, either milling about or in foxholes, while the other side seemed deserted. The strangest thing of all was that the 2 contestants sometimes made troop movements simultaneously in the same territory, one maneuvering on the surface and the other using tunnels beneath. As the Marines struggled to wrest the second airfield from the Japanese, the commanding terrain features rising to the north caught their attention. Some would become known by their elevations, although there were 3 Hill 362s on the island, but others would take the personality and nicknames assigned by the attackers. Hence, the 4th Marine Division would spend itself attacking Hill 382, the amphitheater, and Turkey Knob. The whole bristling complex became known as the Meat Grinder. The 5th Division would earn its spurs and lose most of its invaluable cadre of veteran leaders attacking Nishi Ridge and Hills 362A and 362B, then end the fighting in the Gorge. The 3rd Division would focus first on Hills Peter and 199 Obo, just north of the 2nd Airfield, then the heavily fortified Hill 362C beyond the 3rd Airstrip, and finally the moonscape jungle of stone which would become known as Cushman's Pocket. Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Cushman, Jr., a future commandant, commanded the 2nd Battalion 9th Marines at Iwo Jima. Cushman and his men were veterans of heavy fighting in Guam, yet they were appalled by their first sight of the battlefield. Wrecked and burning Sherman tanks dotted the airstrips. A stream of casualties flowed to the rear. The machine gun fire was terrific. Cushman mounted his troops on the surviving tanks and roared across the field. There they met the same reverse slope defenses which had plagued the 21st Marines. Securing the adjoining 2 small hills, Peter and 199 Obo took the 3rd Marine Division 3 more days of intensely bitter fighting. General Schmidt, considering the 3rd Division attack in the center to be his main effort, provided priority fire support from Corps artillery and directed the other 2 divisions to allocate half their own regimental fire support to the center. None of the commanders was happy with this. Neither the 4th Division, taking heavy casualties in the amphitheater as it approached Hill 382, nor the 5th Division, struggling to seize Nishi Ridge, wanted to dilute their organic fire support. Nor was General Erskine pleased with the results. The main effort, he argued, should clearly receive the main fire. Schmidt never did solve this problem. His corps artillery was too light. He needed twice as many battalions and bigger guns, up to 8-inch howitzers, which the Marine Corps had not yet fielded. He had plenty of naval gunfire support available and used it abundantly, but unless the targets lay in ravines facing the sea, he lost the advantage of direct observed fire. Schmidt's problems of fire support distribution received some alleviation on 26 February when 2 Marine observation planes flew in from the escort carrier Wake Island, the first aircraft to land on Iwo's recaptured and still fire-swept main airstrip. They were Stinson OI single-engine observation planes, nicknamed Grasshoppers, of Lieutenant Tom Rosga's Marine Observation Squadron, VMO-4, and they were followed the next day by similar planes from Lieutenant Roy G. Miller's VMO-5. The intrepid pilots of these frail craft had already had an adventurous time in the waters off Iwo Jima. Several had been launched precariously from the experimental Brody catapult on LST-776, like a peanut from a slingshot. All 14 of the planes of these 2 observation squadrons would receive heavy Japanese fire in battle, not only while airborne, but also while being serviced on the airstrips as well. Yet these 2 squadrons, and elements of VMO-1, would fly nearly 600 missions in support of all 3 divisions. Few units contributed so much to the eventual suppression of Kuribayashi's deadly artillery fire. In time, the mere presence of these small planes overhead would influence Japanese gunners to cease fire and button up against the inevitable counter-battery fire to follow. Often the pilots would undertake pre-dawn or dusk missions simply to extend this protective umbrella over the troops, risky flying given Iwo's unlit fields and constant enemy sniping from the adjacent hills. The 4th Marine Division finally seized Hill 382, the highest point north of Suribachi, but continued to take heavy casualties moving through the amphitheater against Turkey Knob. The 5th Division overran Nishi Ridge, then bloodied itself against Hill 362A's intricate defenses. Said Colonel Thomas A. Warnham, commanding the 27th Marines, of these defenses, "They had interlocking bands of fire the likes of which you never saw." General Cates redeployed the 28th Marines into this slugfest. On 2 March, a Japanese gunner fired a high-velocity shell which killed Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson immediately, 1 week after his glorious seizure of Suribachi's summit. The 28th Marines captured Hill 362A at the cost of 200 casualties. On the same day, Lieutenant Colonel Lowell E. English, commanding the 2nd Battalion 21st Marines, went down with a bullet through his knee. English was bitter. His battalion was being rotated to the rear. We had taken very heavy casualties and were pretty well disorganized. I had less than 300 men left out of the 1,200 I came ashore with. English then received orders to turn his men around and plug a gap in the front lines. It was an impossible order. I couldn't move that disorganized battalion a mile back north in 30 minutes. General Erskine did not want excuses. "You tell that damn English he'd better be there," he told the regimental commander. English fired back, "You tell that son of a bitch I will be there," and I was, but my men were still half a mile behind me and I got a blast through the knee. On the left flank, the 26th Marines mounted its most successful and bloodiest attack of the battle, finally seizing Hill 362B. The day-long struggle cost 500 Marine casualties and produced 5 Medals of Honor. For Captain Frank C. Caldwell, commanding Company F, 1st Battalion 26 Marines, it was the worst single day of the battle. His company suffered 47 casualties in taking the hill, including the 1st Sergeant and the last of the original platoon commanders. Overall, the first 9 days of the 5 Amphibious Corps drive north had produced a net gain of about 4,000 yards at the staggering cost of 7,000 American casualties. Several of the pitched battles, Airfield No. 2, Hill 382, Hill 362B, for example, would of themselves warrant a separate commemorative monograph. The fighting in each case was as savage and bloody as any in Marine Corps history. This was the general situation previously described at the unsuspected turning point on 4 March, D+13, when, despite sustaining frightful losses, the Marines had chewed through a substantial chunk of Kuribayashi's main defenses, forcing the enemy commander to shift his command post to a northern cave. This was the afternoon the first crippled B-29 landed. In terms of American morale, it could not have come at a better time. General Schmidt ordered a general stand-down on 5 March to enable the exhausted assault forces a brief respite and the opportunity to absorb some replacements. The issue of replacement troops during the battle remains controversial even half a century later. General Schmidt, now faced with losses approaching the equivalent of 1 entire division, again urged General Smith to release the 3rd Marines. While each division had been assigned a replacement draft of several thousand Marines, Schmidt wanted the cohesion and combat experience of Colonel James M. Stewart's regimental combat team. Holland Smith believed that the replacement drafts would suffice, presuming that each man in these hybrid units had received sufficient infantry training to enable his immediate assignment to frontline outfits. The problem lay in distributing the replacements in small arbitrary numbers, not as teamed units, to fill the gaping holes in the assault battalions. The new men, expected to replace invaluable veterans of the Pacific War, were not only new to combat, but they also were new to each other, an assortment of strangers lacking the life-saving bonds of unit integrity. "They get killed the day they go into battle," said one division personnel officer in frustration. Replacement losses within the first 48 hours of combat were, in fact, appalling. Those who survived, who learned the ropes and established a bond with the veterans, contributed significantly to the winning of the battle. The division commanders, however, decried the wastefulness of this policy and urged unit replacements by the veteran battalions of the 3rd Marines. As General Erskine recalled, "I asked the question of Kelly Turner and Holland Smith, and the usual answer was, 'You got enough Marines on the island now. There are too damn many here.' I said, 'The solution is very easy. Some of these people are very tired and worn out, so take them out and bring in the 3rd Marines.' And they practically said, 'You keep quiet, we've made the decision,' and that was that." Most surviving senior officers agreed that the decision not to use the 3rd Marines at Iwo Jima was ill-advised and costly. But Holland Smith never wavered. Sufficient troops were on Iwo Jima for the capture of the island. 2 regiments were sufficient to cover the front assigned to General Erskine. On 5 March, D+14, Smith ordered the 3rd Marines to sail back to Guam. Holland Smith may have known the overall statistics of battle losses sustained by the landing force to that point, but he may not have fully appreciated the tremendous attrition of experienced junior officers and senior staff non-commissioned officers taking place every day. As one example, the day after the 3rd Marines, many of whose members were veterans of Bougainville and Guam, departed the amphibious objective area, Company E, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines suffered the loss of its 7th Company commander since the battle began. Likewise, Lieutenant Colonel Cushman's experiences with the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines seemed typical. The casualties were fierce. By the time Iwo Jima was over, I had gone through 2 complete sets of platoon leaders, lieutenants. After that, we had such things as artillery forward observers commanding companies and sergeants leading the platoons, which were less than half strength. It was that bad. Lieutenant Colonel English recalled that by the 12th day, the 2nd Battalion, 21st Marines had lost every company commander. I had 1 company exec left. Lieutenant Colonel Don Robertson, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 27th Marines, lost all 3 of his rifle company commanders, 2 killed by the same damn shell. In many infantry units, platoons ceased to exist. Depleted companies were merged to form 1 half-strength outfit. The Japanese 320mm Spigot Mortar. One of the unique Japanese weapons that Marines encountered on Iwo Jima was the 320mm Spigot Mortar. These enormous defensive weapons were emplaced and operated by the Japanese Army's 20th Independent Mortar Battalion. The mortar tube, which had a small cavity at the muzzle, rested on a steel base plate which, in turn, was supported by a wooden platform. Unlike a conventional mortar, the 5-foot-long projectile was placed over the tube instead of being dropped down the barrel. The mortar shell had a diameter of nearly 13 inches, while the mortar tube was little more than 10 inches wide. The weapon could hurl a 675-pound shell a maximum of 1,440 yards. The range was adjusted by varying the powder charge, while changes in deflection were accomplished by brute force, shoving and pushing the base platform. Although the tubes only held out for 5 or 6 rounds, enough shells were lobbed onto Marine positions to make a lasting impression on those who suffered through that campaign. According to a platoon leader who served with the 28th Marines, the Spigot Mortar, referred to as the Screaming Jesus in his unit, was always afforded a healthy respect and, along with the 8-inch Japanese naval rocket, remains one of his most vivid memories of Iwo Jima. General Robert E. Cushman, Jr., who commanded the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines at Iwo Jima and went on to become the 25th Commandant of the Marine Corps, recalled that the tumbling projectile's inaccuracy made it that much more terrifying. "You could see it coming," he said, "but you never knew where the hell it was going to come down." Kenneth L. Smith Christmas. Marine Corps Air Support during Iwo Jima. For a few special moments just prior to the landing on D-Day at Iwo Jima, the Marines' long-cherished vision of an integrated air-ground team seemed to have been realized. As assault troops neared the beach in their tracked amphibian vehicles, dozens of Marine Vought F-4U Corsairs swept low over the objective, paving the way with rockets and machine gun fire. "It was magnificent," exclaimed one observer. Unfortunately, the 8 Marine fighter squadrons present at Iwo that morning came from the fast carriers of Task Force 58, not the amphibious task force. 3 days later, TF-58 left for good in pursuit of more strategic targets. Thereafter, Navy and Army Air Force pilots provided yeoman service in support of the troops fighting ashore. Sustained close air support of amphibious forces by Marine Air was once again postponed to some future combat proving ground. Other Marine aviation units contributed significantly to the successful seizure of Iwo Jima. One of the first to see action was Marine Bombing Squadron VMB 612, based on Saipan, whose flight crews flew North American PBJ Mitchell medium bombers in nightly, long-range rocket attacks against Japanese ships trying to resupply Iwo Jima from other bases in the Volcano and Bonin Islands. These nightly raids, combined with U.S. Navy submarine interdictions, significantly reduced the amount of ammunition and fortification material, notably barbed wire, delivered to Iwo Jima's defenders before the invasion. The contributions of the pilots and aerial spotters from 3 Marine observation squadrons, VMOs 1, 4, and 5, are described at length in the text. Flying into Iwo initially from escort carriers, or launched precariously by the infamous Brody slingshot from LST-776, or eventually taking off from the captured airstrips, these intrepid crews were quite successful in spotting enemy artillery and mortar positions and reporting them to the Supporting Arms Control Center. When Japanese anti-aircraft gunners managed to down one of the grasshoppers, Marines from all points of the island mourned. Marine transport aircraft from Marine Transport Squadrons, VMR, 952, 253, and 353, based in the Marianas, delivered critical combat cargo to the island during the height of the battle. The Marines frequently relied on aerial delivery before the landing force could establish a fully functional beachhead. On D+10, for example, VMR 952 airdropped critically needed mortar shells, machine gun parts, and blood within Marine lines. On 3 March, Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm S. Mackay, CO of VMR 952, brought in the first Marine transport to land on the island, a Curtiss Commando R-5C loaded with ammunition. All 3 squadrons followed suit, bringing supplies in, taking wounded men out. On 8 March, Marine Torpedo Bomber Squadron, VMTB 242, flew into Iwo Jima from Tinian to assume responsibility for day and night anti-submarine patrols from the departing escort carrier force. Colonel Vernon E. Meggie, USMC, had the distinction of commanding the 1st Landing Force Air Support Control Unit, a milestone in the evolution of amphibious command and control of supporting arms. Meggie came ashore on D+5 with General Schmidt, but the offloading process was still in such disarray that he could not assemble his communications jeeps for another 5 days. This did little to deter Meggie. Using borrowed gear, he quickly moved inland, coordinating the efforts of the air liaison parties, encouraging the Navy pilots to use bigger bombs, and listening to the complaints of the assault commanders. Meggie's subsequent work in training and employing Army P-51 Mustang pilots in direct support was masterful. Before the battle's end, General Kuribayashi transmitted to Tokyo 19 lessons learned about the problems of defending against an American amphibious assault. One of these axioms said, "The enemy's air control is very strong. At least 30 aircraft are flying ceaselessly from early morning to night above this very small island." The bitter end. The American drive north continued after the 5 March stand down, but the going never got any easier. The nature of enemy fire changed, fewer big guns and rockets, less observed fire from the highlands, but now the terrain grew uglier, deteriorating into narrow, twisted gorges, wreathed in sulfur mists, lethal killing zones. Marine casualties continued to mount, but gunshot wounds began to outnumber high-explosive shrapnel hits. The persistent myth among some Marine units that Japanese troops were all nearsighted and hence poor marksmen ended for good at Iwo Jima. In the close-quarters fighting among the badlands of northern Iwo Jima, Japanese riflemen dropped hundreds of advancing Marines with well-aimed shots to the head or chest. "Poor marksmen," snorted Captain Caldwell of Company F, 1st Battalion, 26 Marines. "The Japs we faced all fired expert." Supporting arms coordination grew more effective during the battle. Colonel Buzz Letcher established what some have identified as the first Corps-level Supporting Arms Coordination Center, SAC, in which senior representatives of artillery, naval gunfire, and air support pooled their talents and resources. While Letcher lacked the manpower and communications equipment to serve as Corps artillery officer and simultaneously run a full-time SAC, his efforts represented a major advancement in this difficult art. So did Colonel Vernon Maggie's Landing Force Air Support Control Unit, which worked in relative harmony with the fledgling SAC. Instances of friendly fire still occurred, perhaps inevitably on that crowded island, but positive control at the highest level did much to reduce the frequency of such accidents. In terms of response time, multiple source coordination probably worked better at the division level and below. Most infantry battalions, for example, had nothing but praise for the air liaison parties, shore fire control parties, and artillery forward observer teams which deployed with each maneuver unit. While the Marines remained angry at the paucity of the overall preliminary naval bombardment of Iwo Jima, all hands valued the continuous and responsive support received from D-Day onward. Many of the gunfire ships stood in close, frequently less than a mile offshore, to deliver along the flanks and front lines, and many took hits from massed Japanese coast defense batteries. There were literally no safe zones in or around the island. Two aspects of naval gunfire at Iwo Jima rate special mention. One was the extent to which the ships provided illumination rounds over the battlefield, especially during the early days before landing force artillery could assume the bulk of these missions. The second unique aspect was the degree of assistance provided by the smallest gunships, frequently modified landing craft armed with 4.2-inch mortars, rockets, or 20mm guns. These small boys proved invaluable, especially along the northwest coast where they frequently worked in lockstep with the 5th Marine Division as it approached the gorge. While the Marines comprised the bulk of the landing force at Iwo Jima, they received early and increasing support from elements of the U.S. Army. Two of the 4 DUKW companies employed on D-Day were Army units. The 138th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Group provided 90mm AA batteries around the newly captured airfields. Major General James E. Chaney, U.S. Army, who would become island commander, Iwo Jima, at the battle's end, landed on D+8 with advance elements of the 145th Infantry. As far as the Marines on the ground were concerned, the most welcome Army units flew into Iwo Jima on 6 March, D+15. This was the 15th Fighter Group, the vanguard of 7 Fighter Command destined to accompany the B-29s over Tokyo. The group included the 47th Fighter Squadron, a seasoned outfit of North American P-51 Mustangs. Although the Army pilots had no experience in direct air support of ground troops, Colonel Maggie liked their eager beaver attitude and willingness to learn. He also appreciated the fact that the Mustangs could deliver 1,000-pound bombs. Maggie quickly trained the Army pilots in striking designated targets on nearby islands in response to a surface-based controller. In 3 days, they were ready for Iwo Jima. Maggie instructed the P-51 pilots to arm their bombs with 12-second delay fuses, attack parallel to the front lines, and approach from a 45-degree angle. Sometimes these tactics produced spectacular results, especially along the west coast, where the big bombs with delayed fuses blew the sides of entire cliffs into the ocean, exposing enemy caves and tunnels to direct fire from the sea. "The Air Force boys did a lot of good," said Maggie. With that, the escort carriers departed the area and left close air support to the 47th Fighter Squadron for the duration of the battle. While technically not a supporting arm, the field medical support provided the assault Marines, primarily by the Navy, was a major contributor to victory in the prolonged battle. The practice of integrating surgeons, chaplains, and corpsmen within the Fleet Marine Force units continued to pay valuable dividends. In many cases, company corpsmen were just as tough and combat savvy as the Marines they accompanied. In all cases, a wounded Marine immediately knew his corpsman would move heaven and earth to reach him, bind his wounds, and start the long process of evacuation. Most Marines at Iwo Jima would echo the sentiments of Staff Sergeant Alfred I. Thomas, a half-truck platoon commander in the 25th Marines. "We had outstanding corpsmen. They were just like family." Unfortunately, the luxury of having first-rate medical assistance so close to the front lines took a terrible toll. 23 doctors and 827 corpsmen were killed or wounded at Iwo Jima, a casualty rate twice as high as bloody Saipan. Rarely had combat medical support been so thoughtfully prepared and provided as at Iwo Jima. Beyond the crude aid stations, further toward the rear, Navy and Army field hospitals arose. Some Marines would be wounded, receive treatment in a field hospital tent, recuperate in a bunker, and return to the lines, often to receive a second or third wound. The more seriously wounded would be evacuated off the island, either by direct air to Guam or via one of several fully staffed hospital ships which operated around the clock within the amphibious objective area. Within the first month of the fighting on Iwo Jima, 13,737 wounded Marines and corpsmen were evacuated by hospital ship, another 2,449 by airlift. For a wounded Marine, the hazardous period came during the first few minutes after he went down. Japanese snipers had no compunctions about picking off litter crews or corpsmen or sometimes the wounded man himself as his buddies tried to slide him clear of the fire. One of the most celebrated examples of casualty evacuation occurred after a Japanese sniper shot Corporal Edwin J. Cantor, a rocket truck crew chief in the 4th Marine Division, through the abdomen. The rocket trucks always drew an angry fusillade of counter-battery fire from the Japanese, and Cantor's friends knew they had to get him away from the launch site fast. As a nearby motion picture crew recorded the drama, 4 Marines hustling Cantor down a muddy hillside heard the scream of an incoming shell, dumped the wounded man unceremoniously, and scattered for cover. The explosion killed the film crew and wounded each of the Marines, including Cantor again. The film footage survived, appeared in stateside newsreels, and eventually became part of the movie Sands of Iwo Jima. Cantor was evacuated to a hospital ship, thence to hospitals in Guam, Hawaii, and the States. His war had ended. Meanwhile, the beachmasters and shore party personnel performed spectacular feats to keep the advancing divisions fully armed and equipped. It is difficult to imagine the scope of logistical management and sheer back-breaking work required to maintain such a high volume of supplies and equipment moving over such precarious beaches. A single beach on the west coast became functional on D+11, but by that time the bulk of landing for supplies were on shore. General unloading ended the next day, releasing the vulnerable amphibious ships from their tether to the beachhead. Thereafter, ammunition resupply became the critical factor. On one occasion, well-aimed Japanese fire detonated the entire 5th Marine Division ammo dump. In another tense moment, the ammunition ship Columbia Victory came under direct Japanese fire as she approached the western beaches to commence unloading. Watching Marines held their breath as the ship became bracketed by fire. The ship escaped, but the potential still existed for a disaster of catastrophic proportions. The 2nd Separate Engineer Battalion and the 62nd Naval Construction Battalion, Seabees, repaired and extended the captured runways. In short order, an entire Seabee brigade moved ashore. Marines returning to the beaches from the northern highlands could hardly recognize the place they had first seen on D-Day. There were now more than 80,000 Americans on the small island. Seabees had bulldozed a 2-lane road up to the top of Suribachi. Communications, often maligned in earlier amphibious assaults, were never better than at Iwo Jima. Radios and handsets were now waterproof, more frequencies were available, and a variety of radio systems served the varying needs of the landing force. Forward observer teams, for example, used the backpack SCR-610, while companies and platoons favored the SCR-300 walkie-talkies, or the even lighter SCR-536 spam can portables. Said Lieutenant Colonel James P. Berkeley, Executive Officer of the 27th Marines and a former communications officer, "At Iwo, we had near-perfect communications, all any commander could ask for." As the battle progressed, the Marines began stringing telephone lines between support units and forward command posts, wisely elevating the wire along upright posts to avoid damage by tracked vehicles. Japanese counterintelligence teams expected to have a field day splicing into the proliferation of U.S. telephone lines, but the Marines baffled them by heavy use of Navajo code talkers. Each division employed about 24 trained Navajos. The 5th Marine Division Command Post established 6 Navajo networks upon arrival on the island. No one, throughout the war, insofar as anyone knew, was ever able to translate the Navajo code talkers' voice transmissions. African American troops played a significant role in the capture of Iwo Jima. Negro drivers served in the Army DUKW units active throughout the landing. Black Marines of the 8th Ammunition Company and the 36th Depot Company landed on D-Day, served as stevedores on those chaotic beaches, and were joined by the 33rd and 34th Depot Companies on D+3. These Marines were incorporated into the VAC Shore Party, which did Herculean work sustaining the momentum of the American drive northwards. When Japanese counterattacks penetrated to the beach areas, these Marines dropped their cargo, unslung their carbines, and engaged in well-disciplined fire and maneuver, inflicting more casualties than they sustained. 2 Marines, Privates James W. Whitlock and James Davis, received the Bronze Star. Said Colonel Leland S. Swindler, commanding the VAC Shore Party, the entire body of Black Marines conducted themselves with marked coolness and courage. News media coverage of the Iwo Jima battle was extensive and largely unfettered. Typical of the scores of combat correspondents who stuck with the landing force throughout the battle was Marine Technical Sergeant Frederick K. Dick Dashiell, a former Associated Press writer assigned to the 3rd Marine Division. Although downright scared sometimes and filled with horror often, Dashiell stood the test, for he wrote 81 frontline communiques, pounding out news releases on his portable typewriter on the edge of his foxhole. Dashiell's eye for detail caught the flavor of the prolonged assault. "All is bitter frontal assault, always uphill," he wrote. He described how the ceaseless wind filled the air with fine volcanic grit, and how often the Marines had to stop and clean the grit from their weapons, and how naked that made any Marine feel. Most Marines were exhausted at this point in the battle. Occasional hot food delivered close behind the front lines, or more frequently, fresh fruit and milk from the nearby ships helped morale some. So did watching more and more crippled B-29s soar in for emergency landings, often 2 or 3 a day. "It felt good to see them land," said Sergeant James Doc Lindsay, a squad leader in Company G, 2nd Battalion, 25th Marines. "You knew they'd just come from Tokyo." General Erskine came down with pneumonia during this period, but refused to be evacuated. Colonel Robert E. Hogeboom, his chief of staff, quietly kept the war moving. The division continued to advance. When Erskine recovered, Hogeboom adjusted accordingly. The two were a highly effective team. Erskine had long sought the opportunity to conduct a battalion-sized night operation. It rankled him that throughout the war the Americans seemed to have conceded the night to the Japanese. When Hill 362C continued to thwart his advance, Erskine directed a pre-dawn advance devoid of the trappings of prep fires which always seemed to identify the time and place of attack. The distinction of making this unusual assault went to Lieutenant Colonel Harold C. Bing Bame, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines. Unfortunately, this battalion was new to this particular sector and received the attack order too late the previous day to reconnoiter effectively. The absence of advanced orientation notwithstanding, the battalion crossed the line of departure promptly and silently at 0500 and headed for Hill 362C. The unit attained total surprise along its axis of advance. Before the sleepy Japanese knew it, the battalion had hurried across 500 yards of broken ground, sweeping by the outposts and roasting the occasional strong point with flamethrowers. Then it was Bame's turn to be surprised. Daylight revealed his battalion had captured the wrong hill, an intermediate objective. Hill 362C still lay 250 yards distant. Now he was surrounded by a sea of wide-awake and furiously counterattacking Japanese infantry. Bame did what seemed natural. He redeployed his battalion and attacked towards the original objective. This proved very rough going and took much of the day, but before dark, the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines stood in sole possession of Hill 362C, one of Kuribayashi's main defensive anchors. Bame's success, followed shortly by General Senda's costly counterattack against the 4th Marine Division, seemed to represent another turning point of the battle. On D+18, a patrol from the 3rd Marine Division reached the northeast coast. The squad leader filled a canteen with salt water and sent it back to General Schmidt, marked, "For inspection, not consumption." Schmidt welcomed the symbolism. The next day, the 4th Marine Division finally pinched out Turkey Knob, moving out of the amphitheater towards the east coast. The end seemed tantalizingly close, but the intensity of Japanese resistance hardly waned. Within the 5th Marine Division's zone in the west, the 2nd Battalion 26 Marines was reporting an aggregate casualty rate approaching 70%. General Rocky warned of a state of extreme exhaustion and fatigue. The division commanders began to look elsewhere for relief of their shot-up battalions. In the 4th Marine Division, General Cates formed a provisional battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Melvin L. Krulwich, which conducted a series of attacks against the many bypassed enemy positions. The term mopping up, as applied to Iwo Jima, whether by service troops or subsequent Army garrison units, should be considered relative. Many pockets of Japanese held out indefinitely, well-armed and defiant to the end. Rooting them out was never easy. Other divisions used cannoneers, pioneers, mortar transport units, and Amtrackers as light infantry units, either to augment frontline battalions or conduct combat patrols throughout rear areas. By this time, however, the extreme rear area at Iwo had become overconfident. Movies were being shown every night, ice cream could be found on the beach, men swam in the surf and slept in tents. This all provided a false and deadly sense of security. Not very far to the north, Lieutenant Colonel Cushman's 2nd Battalion 9th Marines became engaged in a sustained battle in extremely broken terrain east of the 3rd Airfield. The Marines eventually encircled the Japanese positions, but the battle for Cushman's Pocket raged on. As the battalion commander reported the action, the enemy position was a maze of caves, pillboxes, in-place tanks, stone walls, and trenches. We beat against this position for 8 continuous days, using every supporting weapon. The core, main objective of the sector, still remained. The battalion was exhausted. Almost all leaders were gone, and the battalion numbered about 400, including 350 replacements. Cushman's 2nd Battalion 9th Marines was relieved, but other elements of the 9th and 21st Marines, equally exhausted, had just as difficult a time. Erskine truly had no reserves. He called Cushman back into the pocket. By 16 March, D+25, Japanese resistance in this thicket of jumbled rocks ended. The 4th Marine Division, meanwhile, poured over the hills along the east, seizing the coast road and blasting the last Japanese strongpoints from the rear. 90% of Iwo Jima now lay in American hands. Radio Tokyo carried the mournful remarks of Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso, who announced the fall of Iwo Jima as the most unfortunate thing in the whole war situation. General Smith took the opportunity to declare victory and conduct a flag-raising ceremony. With that, the old war horse departed. Admiral Turner had sailed previously. Admiral Hill and General Schmidt finally had the campaign to themselves. Survivors of the 4th Division began backloading on board ship, their battle finally over. The killing continued in the north. The 5th Marine Division entered the Gorge, an 800-yard pocket of incredibly broken country which the troops would soon call Death Valley. Here, General Kuribayashi maintained his final command center in a deep cave. Fighting in this ungodly landscape provided a fitting end to the battle. 9 endless days of cave-by-cave assaults with flamethrowers and demolitions. Combat engineers used 8,500 tons of explosives to detonate one huge fortification. Progress was slow and costlier than ever. General Rocky's drained and depleted regiments lost one more man with every 2 yards gained. To ease the pressure, General Schmidt deployed the 3rd Marine Division against Kitano Point in the 5th Division zone. Colonel Hartnell J. Withers directed the final assault of his 21st Marines against the extreme northern tip of the island. General Erskine, pneumonia be damned, came forward to look over his shoulder. The 21st Marines could see the end, and their momentum proved irresistible. In half a day of sharp fighting, they cleared the point of the last defenders. Erskine signaled Schmidt, "Kitano Point is taken." Both divisions made serious efforts to persuade Kuribayashi to surrender during these final days, broadcasting appeals in Japanese, sending personal messages praising his valor and urging his cooperation. Kuribayashi remained a samurai to the end. He transmitted one final message to Tokyo, saying, "We have not eaten or drunk for 5 days, but our fighting spirit is still running high. We are going to fight bravely to the last." Imperial headquarters tried to convey the good news to him that the emperor had approved his promotion to full general. There was no response from Iwo Jima. Kuribayashi's promotion would be posthumous. Fragmentary Japanese accounts indicate he took his own life during the night of 25 to 26 March. In the gorge, the 5th Marine Division kept clawing forward. The division reported that the average battalion, which had landed with 36 officers and 885 men on D-Day, now mustered 16 officers and 300 men, including the hundreds of replacements funneled in during the fighting. The remnants of the 1st Battalion 26 Marines and the 1st Battalion 28th Marines squeezed the Japanese into a final pocket, then overwhelmed them. It was the evening of 25 March, D+34, and the amphibious assault on the rocky fortress of Iwo Jima finally appeared over. The island grew strangely quiet. There were far fewer illumination shells. In the flickering false light, some saw shadowy figures moving south towards the airfield. General Schmidt received the good news that the 5th Marine Division had snuffed out the final enemy cave in the gorge on the evening of D+34. But even as the Corps commander prepared his announcement declaring the end of organized resistance on Iwo Jima, a very well-organized enemy force emerged from northern caves and infiltrated down the length of the island. This final spasm of Japanese opposition still reflected the influence of Kuribayashi's tactical discipline. The 300-man force took all night to move into position around the island's now vulnerable rear base area, the tents occupied by freshly arrived Army pilots of 7 Fighter Command, adjacent to Airfield No. 1. The counterattacking force achieved total surprise, falling on the sleeping pilots out of the darkness with swords, grenades, and automatic weapons. The fighting was as vicious and bloody as any that occurred in Iwo Jima's many arenas. The surviving pilots and members of the 5th Pioneer Battalion improvised a skirmish line and launched a counterattack of their own. Seabees and elements of the redeploying 28th Marines joined the fray. There were few suicides among the Japanese. Most died in place, grateful to strike one final blow for the Emperor. Sunrise revealed the awful carnage. 300 dead Japanese, more than 100 slain pilots, Seabees, and pioneers, and another 200 American wounded. It was a grotesque closing chapter to 5 continuous weeks of savagery. The 5th Marine Division and the 21st Marines wasted no time in backloading onboard amphibious ships. The 9th Marines, last of the VAC maneuver units to land, became the last to leave, conducting 2 more weeks of ambushes and combat patrols. The 147th Infantry inherited more of the same. In the first 2 months after the Marines left, the Army troops killed 1,602 Japanese and captured 867 more. The Marines' Zippo tanks. To the Marines on the ground, the Sherman M4A3 medium tank, equipped with the Navy Mark I flamethrower, seemed to be the most valuable weapon employed in the Battle of Iwo Jima. The Marines had come a long way in the tactical use of fire in the 15 months since Tarawa, when only a handful of backpack flamethrowers were available to combat the island's hundreds of fortifications. While the landing force still relied on portable flamethrowers, most Marines could see the value of marrying the technology with armored vehicles for use against the toughest targets. In the Marianas, the Marines modified M3A1 light tanks with the Canadian Ronson flame system to good effect. The problems came from the vulnerability of the small vehicles. At Peleliu, the 1st Marine Division mounted the improvised Mark I system on a thin-skinned LVT-4. Again, vehicle vulnerability limited the system's effectiveness. The obvious solution seemed to be to mount the flamethrower in a medium tank. The first modification to Sherman tanks involved the installation of the small E-4-5 mechanized flamethrower in place of the bow machine gun. This was only a marginal improvement. The system's short range, modest fuel supply, and awkward aiming process hardly offset the loss of the machine gun. Even so, each of the 3 tank battalions employed E-4-5 equipped Shermans during Iwo Jima. The best solution to marrying effective flame projection with mechanized mobility resulted from an unlikely inter-service task force of Seabees, Army Chemical Warfare Service technicians, and Fleet Marine Force tankers in Hawaii before the invasion. According to Lieutenant Colonel William R. Collins, commanding the 5th Tank Battalion, this inspired group of field-expedient tinkers modified the Mark I flamethrower to operate from within the Sherman's turret, replacing the 75mm main gun with a look-alike launch tube. The modified system could thus be trained and pointed like any conventional turret gun. Using napalm-thickened fuel, the Zippo tanks could spew flame up to 150 yards for a duration of 55 to 80 seconds, both quantum tactical improvements. Unfortunately, the ad hoc modification team had only sufficient time and components to modify 8 M4A3 tanks with the Mark I flame system. 4 each went to the 4th and 5th Tank Battalions. The 3rd Tank Battalion, then staging in Guam, received neither the M4A3 Shermans nor the field modifications in time for Iwo Jima, although a number of their A2 tanks retained the E-4-5 system mounted in the bow. The 8 modified Sherman flame tanks proved ideal against Iwo Jima's rugged caves and concrete fortifications. The Japanese feared this weapon greatly. Time and again, suicide squads of human bullets would assail the flame tanks directly, only to be shot down by covering forces or scorched by the main weapon. Enemy fire and the rough terrain took their toll on the 8 flame tanks, but maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep them functional. In the words of Captain Frank C. Caldwell, a company commander in the 26th Marines, "In my view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. Tactical demands for the flame tanks never diminished. Late in the battle, as the 5th Marine Division cornered the last Japanese defenders in the gorge, the 5th Tank Battalion expended napalm-thickened fuel at a rate of 10,000 gallons per day. The division's final action report stated that the flame tank was the one weapon that caused the Japs to leave their caves and rock crevices and run." Iwo's Fire Brigades, the rocket detachments. Attached to the assault divisions of the landing force at Iwo Jima were provisional rocket detachments. The infantry had a love-hate relationship with the forward-deploying little rocket trucks and their plucky crews. The system was an international 1-ton 4x4 truck modified to carry 3 box-shaped launchers, each containing a dozen 4.5-inch rockets. A good crew could launch a ripple of 36 rockets within a matter of seconds, providing a blanket of high explosives on the target. This the infantry loved, but each launching always drew heavy return fire from the Japanese, who feared the automatic artillery. The Marines formed an experimental rocket unit in June 1943 and first deployed rail-launched barrage rockets during the fighting in the Upper Solomons. There the heavily canopied jungles limited their effectiveness. Once mounted on trucks and deployed to the Central Pacific, however, the weapons proved much more useful, particularly during the Battle of Saipan. The Marines modified the small trucks by reinforcing the tailgate to serve as a blast shield, installing a hydraulic jack to raise and lower the launchers, and applying gravity quadrants and elevation safety chains. Crude steel rods welded to the bumper and dashboard helped the driver align the vehicle with aiming stakes. Treeless, hilly Iwo Jima proved an ideal battleground for these so-called Buck Rogers men. At Iwo, the 1st Provisional Rocket Detachment supported the 4th Marine Division, and the 3rd Detachment supported the 5th Division throughout the operation. The 3rd Division did not have such a unit in this battle. Between them, the 2 detachments fired more than 30,000 rockets in support of the landing force. The 3rd Detachment landed over Red Beach on D-Day, losing one vehicle to the surf, others to the loose sand or heavy enemy fire. One vehicle reached its firing position intact and launched a salvo of rockets against Japanese fortifications along the slopes of Suribachi, detonating an enemy ammunition dump. The detachment subsequently supported the 1st Battalion 28th Marines advance to the summit, often launching single rockets to clear suspected enemy positions along the route. As the fighting moved north, the short-range, steep angle of fire and saturation effect of the rocket launchers kept them in high demand. They were particularly valuable in defilade-to-defilade bombardments marking the final punctuation of pre-assault prep fires. But their distinctive flash and telltale blast also caught the attention of Japanese artillery spotters. The rocket trucks rarely remained in one place long enough to fire more than 2 salvos. Speedy displacement was the key to their survival. The nearby infantry knew better than to stand around and wave goodbye. This was the time to seek deep shelter from the counter-battery fire sure to follow. Amphibious logistical support at Iwo Jima. The logistical effort required to sustain the seizure of Iwo Jima was enormous, complex, largely improvised on lessons learned in the earlier Marine Corps operations in the Pacific, and highly successful. Clearly, no other element of the emerging art of amphibious warfare had improved so greatly by the winter of 1945. Marines may have had the heart and firepower to tackle a fortress like Iwo Jima earlier in the war, but they would have been crippled in the doing of it by limitations in amphibious logistical support capabilities. These concepts, procedures, organizations, and special materials took years to develop. Once in place, they fully enabled such large-scale conquests as Iwo Jima and Okinawa. For the Iwo Jima operation, VAC had the 8th Field Depot, commanded by Colonel Leland S. Swindler. The depot was designed to serve as the nucleus of the shore party operation. The depot commander was dual-hatted as the shore party commander of the landing force, in which capacity he was responsible for coordinating the activities of the division shore parties. The timing of the logistic support at Iwo proved to be well conceived and executed. Liaison teams from the 8th Field Depot accompanied the 4th and 5th Divisions ashore. On D+3, units of the Field Depot came ashore, and 2 days after this, when VAC assumed control on shore, the Field Depot took over and the unloading continued without interruption. The 5 Amphibious Corps at Iwo Jima used every conceivable means of delivering combat cargo ashore when and where needed by the landing force. These means sequentially involved the prescribed loads and units of fire carried by the assault waves, hot cargo preloaded in on-call waves or floating dumps, experimental use of one-shot preload amphibious trailers and Wilson drums, general unloading, administrative unloading of what later generations of amphibians would call an assault follow-on echelon, and aerial delivery of critically short items, first by parachute, then by transports landing on the captured runways. In the process, the Navy Marine Corps team successfully experimented with the use of armored bulldozers and sleds loaded with hinged Marston matting delivered in the assault waves to help clear wheeled vehicles stuck in the soft volcanic sand. In spite of formidable early obstacles, foul weather, heavy surf, dangerous undertows, and fearsome enemy fire, the system worked. Combat cargo flowed in, casualties and salvaged equipment flowed out. Shortages appeared from time to time, largely the result of the Marines on shore meeting a stronger and larger defense garrison than estimated. Hence, urgent calls soon came for more demolitions, grenades, mortar illumination rounds, flamethrower recharging units, and whole blood. Transport squadrons delivered many of these critical items directly from fleet bases in the Marianas. Field medical support at Iwo Jima was a model of exhaustive planning and flexible application. The Marines had always enjoyed the finest immediate medical attention from their organic surgeons and corpsmen, but the backup system ashore at Iwo Jima, from field hospitals to graves registration, was mind-boggling to the older veterans. Moderately wounded Marines received full hospital treatment and rehabilitation. many returned directly to their units, thus preserving at least some of the rapidly decreasing levels of combat experience in frontline outfits. The more seriously wounded were treated, stabilized, and evacuated, either to offshore hospital ships or by air transport to Guam. The Marines fired an unprecedented 500,000 artillery rounds in direct and general support of the assault units. More rounds were lost when the 5th Marine Division dump blew up. The flow never stopped. The shore party used DUKWs, LVTs, and larger craft for rapid offloading of ammunition ships dangerously exposed to Iwo Jima's enemy gunners. Marine Corps ammunition and depot companies hustled the fresh munitions ashore and into the neediest hands. Lieutenant Colonel James D. Hiddle, USMC, served as D4 of the 3rd Marine Division throughout the Battle of Iwo Jima. While shaking his head at the crazy quilt logistic adaptations dictated by Iwo's geography, Hiddle saw creative staff management at all levels. The 3rd Division, earmarked as the reserve for the landing, found it difficult to undertake combat loading of their ships in the absence of a scheme of maneuver on shore, but the staff made valid assumptions based on their earlier experiences. This paid huge dividends when the Corps commander had to commit the 21st Marines as a separate tactical unit well in advance of the division. Thanks to foresightful combat loading, the regiment landed fully equipped and supported, ready for immediate deployment in the fighting. To augment the supplies coming across the beach, the 3rd Division Staff Air Officer appropriated a transport plane and made regular runs to the division's base in Guam, bringing back fresh beef, mail, and cases of beer. The 3rd Division G4 also sent his transport quartermaster, today's embarkation officer, out to sea with an LVT full of war souvenirs. These were bartered with ship's crews for donations of fresh fruit, eggs, bread. We'd take anything. General Erskine distributed these treats personally to the men in the lines. Retired Brigadier General Hiddle marveled at the density of troops funneled into the small island. At one point, we had 60,000 men occupying less than 3.5 square miles of broken terrain. These produced startling neighbors. A 105mm battery firing from the middle of the shore party cantonment, the division command post sighted 1,000 yards from Japanese lines, giant B-29s taking off and landing forward of the CP of an assault regiment. In the effort to establish a freshwater distilling plant, Marine engineers dug a well near the beach. Instead of a source of salt water, the crew discovered steaming mineral water, heated by Suribachi's supposedly dormant volcano. Hiddle moved the 3rd Division distilling site elsewhere. This spot became a hot water shower facility, soon one of the most popular places on the island. Iwo Jima's costs, gains, and legacies. In its 36 days of combat on Iwo Jima, the 5 Amphibious Corps killed approximately 22,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors. The cost was staggering. The assault units of the Corps, Marines, and organic Navy personnel sustained 24,053 casualties, by far the highest single action losses in Marine Corps history. Of these, a total of 6,140 died. Roughly 1 Marine or Corpsman became a casualty for every 3 who landed on Iwo Jima. According to a subsequent analysis by military historian Dr. Norman Cooper, nearly 700 Americans gave their lives for every square mile. For every plot of ground the size of a football field, an average of more than 1 American and 5 Japanese were killed, and 5 Americans were wounded. The assault infantry units bore the brunt of these losses. Captain William T. Ketchum's Company I, 3rd Battalion, 24th Marines landed on D-Day with 133 Marines and 3 rifle platoons. Only 9 of these men remained when the remnants of the company re-embarked on D+35. Captain Frank C. Caldwell reported the loss of 221 men from Company F, 1st Battalion, 26 Marines. At the end, a private first class served as platoon commander for Caldwell's merged 1st and 2nd platoons. Elsewhere in the 1st Battalion, 26 Marines, Captain Tom Fields relinquished command of Company D on the 8th day to replace the battalion executive officer. Rejoining his company at the end of the battle, Fields was sickened to find only 17 of the original 250 men still in the ranks. Company B, 1st Battalion 28th Marines, went through 9 company commanders in the fighting. 12 different Marines served as platoon leader of the 2nd Platoon, including 2 buck privates. Each division, each regiment reported similar conditions. As the extent of the losses became known in the press, the American public reacted with shock and dismay as they had 14 months earlier at Tarawa. This time, however, the debate about the high cost of forcibly seizing an enemy island raged in the press while the battle was still being fought. The Marine Corps released only one official communique about specific battle losses during the battle, reporting casualties of nearly 5,000 men on 22 February. 5 days later, at the insistence of press baron William Randolph Hearst, an early supporter of the MacArthur for President claque, the San Francisco Examiner ran a front-page editorial bewailing the Marines' tactics and losses. "It's the same thing that happened at Tarawa and Saipan," the editorial stated, urging the elevation of General MacArthur to supreme command in the Pacific because he saves the lives of his own men. With that, 100 off-duty Marines stormed the offices of the Examiner demanding an apology. Unfortunately, the Hearst editorial received wide play. Many families of Marines fighting at Iwo Jima forwarded the clippings. Marines received these in the mail while the fighting still continued, an unwelcome blow to morale. President Roosevelt, long a master of public opinion, managed to keep the lid on the outcry by emphasizing the sacrifice of the troops as epitomized by the Joe Rosenthal photograph of the 2nd Suribachi flag raising. The photograph was already widely renowned. FDR made it the official logo of the 7th War Bond Drive and demanded the 6 flag raisers be reassigned home to enhance popular morale. Regrettably, 3 of the 6 men had already been killed in subsequent fighting in the drive north on Iwo Jima. The Joint Chiefs of Staff looked appraisingly at Iwo Jima's losses. No one questioned the objective. Iwo Jima was an island that categorically had to be seized if the strategic bombing campaign was ever going to be effective. The island could therefore not be bypassed or leapfrogged. There is considerable evidence that the Joint Chiefs considered the use of poison gas during the Iwo Jima planning phase. Neither Japan nor the United States had signed the international moratorium. There were no civilians on the island. The Americans had stockpiles of mustard gas shells in the Pacific Theater. But President Roosevelt scotched these considerations quickly. America, he declared, would never make first use of poison gas. In any case, the use of poison gas on an area as relatively small as Iwo Jima, whose prevailing winds would quickly dissipate the gas fumes, became moot. This left the landing force with no option but a frontal amphibious assault against the most heavily fortified island America ever faced in the war. On the other hand, Seizure of Iwo Jima provided significant strategic benefits. Symbolically, the Marines raised the flag over Mount Suribachi on the same day that General MacArthur entered Manila. The parallel capture of the Philippines and Iwo Jima, followed immediately by the invasion of Okinawa, accelerated the pace of the war, bringing it at long last to Japan's doorstep. The 3 campaigns convincingly demonstrated to the Japanese High Command that the Americans now had the capability and the will to overwhelm even the most stoutly defended islands. Kyushu and Honshu would be next. Iwo Jima in American hands produced immediate and highly visible benefits to the strategic bombing campaign. Marines fighting on the island were reminded of this mission time and again as crippled B-29 superforts flew in from Honshu. The capture of Iwo Jima served to increase the operating range, payload, and survival rate of the big bombers. The monthly tonnage of high explosives dropped on Imperial Japan by B-29s based in the Marianas increased 11-fold in March alone. As early as 7 April, a force of 80 P-51 Mustangs of 7 Fighter Command took off from Iwo Jima to escort B-29 striking the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Plant in Tokyo. But the Army Air Force valued Iwo Jima most of all as an emergency landing field. By war's end, a total of 2,251 B-29s made forced landings on the island. This figure represented 24,761 flight crewmen, many of whom would have perished at sea without the availability of Iwo Jima as a safe haven. Said one B-29 pilot, "Whenever I land on this island, I thank God for the men who fought for it." General Tadamichi Kiribayashi proved to be one of the most competent field commanders the Marines ever faced. He displayed a masterful grasp of the principles of simplicity and economy of force, made maximum use of Iwo's forbidding terrain, employed his artillery and mortars with great skill, and exercised command with an iron will virtually to the end. He was also a realist. Without hope of even temporary naval or air superiority, he knew he was doomed from the start. In 5 weeks of unremitting pressure, the Americans breached every strong point, exterminated his forces, and seized the island. Iwo Jima represented at once the supreme test and the pinnacle of American amphibious capabilities in the Pacific War. The sheer magnitude of the task, planning the assault and sustaining of that many troops against such a formidable objective, made Operation Detachment an enduring model of detailed planning and violent execution. Here the element of surprise was not available to the attacker. Yet the speed of the American landing and the toughness with which assault units withstood the withering barrages astounded the Japanese defenders. The landing on Iwo was the epitome of everything we'd learned over the years about amphibious assaults, said Colonel Warnham of the 27th Marines. Bad as the enemy fire became on D-Day, there were no reports of issue in doubt. Lieutenant Colonel Galler compared Iwo Jima with his Guadalcanal experience. Then it was, can we hold? Here at Iwo Jima, the question was simply, when can we get it over? The ship-to-shore assault at Iwo was impressive enough, but the real measure of amphibious effectiveness can be seen in the massive, sustained logistical support which somehow flowed over those treacherous beaches. Not only did the Marines have all the ammunition and flamethrower refills they needed around the clock, but they also had many of the less obvious necessities and niceties which marked this battle as different from its predecessors. Marines on Iwo had ample quantities of whole blood, some of it donated barely 2 weeks in advance, flown in, refrigerated, and available. The Marines also had mail call, unit newsletters, fresh water, radio batteries, fresh baked bread, and prefabricated burial markers, thousands of them. Iwo Jima featured superior inter-service cooperation. The Navy Marine Corps team rarely functioned more efficiently. The Blue Water Navy continued to earn the respect of the Marines, especially on D-2 when the flotilla of tiny LCI gunboats bravely attacked the coastal defense guns to protect the Navy and Marine frogmen. Likewise, the Marines welcomed the contributions of the Army, Coast Guard, Coast and Geodetic Survey, Red Cross, and the host of combat correspondents, all of whom shared both the misery and the glory of the prolonged battle. 2 aspects of the battle remain controversial: the inadequate preliminary bombardment and the decision to use piecemeal replacements instead of organized units to strengthen the assault forces. Both decisions, rendered in the context of several competing factors, were made by experienced commanders in good faith. Unavoidably, Iwo Jima's biggest cost to the 5 Amphibious Corps was the loss of so many combat veterans in taking the island. While the battle served to create a new generation of veterans among the survivors, many proud regiments suffered devastating losses. With these same units already designated as key components of the landing force against the Japanese home islands, such losses had serious potential implications. These factors may well have influenced General Holland Smith's unpopular decision to withhold the 3rd Marines from the battle. From the perspective of an exhausted company commander on Iwo Jima, Smith's decision seemed inexcusable, then and now. From the wider perspective of the commanding general, Fleet Marine Forces Pacific, the decision makes more sense. Whatever his shortcomings, Holland Smith probably knew amphibious warfare better than anyone. Of the hundreds of after-action reports filed immediately following the battle, his official analysis best captured the essence of the struggle. There was no hope of surprise, either strategic or tactical. There was little possibility for tactical initiative. The entire operation was fought on what were virtually the enemy's own terms. The strength, disposition, and conduct of the enemy's defense required a major penetration of the heart of his prepared positions in the center of the Motoyama Plateau and a subsequent reduction of the positions in the difficult terrain sloping to the shore on the flanks. The size and terrain of the island precluded any forced beachhead line. It was an operation of one phase and one tactic. From the time the engagement was joined until the mission was completed, it was a matter of frontal assault maintained with relentless pressure by a superior mass of troops and supporting arms against a position fortified to the maximum practical extent. We Americans of subsequent generation in the profession of arms find it difficult to imagine a sustained amphibious assault under such conditions. In some respects, the fighting on Iwo Jima took on the features of Marines fighting in France in 1918, described by one as a war girt with horrors. We sensed the drama repeated every morning on Iwo, after the prep fires lifted, when the riflemen, engineers, corpsmen, flame tank crews, and armored bulldozer operators somehow found the fortitude to move out yet again into Death Valley or the meat grinder. Few of us today can study the defenses, analyze the action reports, or walk the broken ground without experiencing a sense of reverence for the men who won that epic battle. Fleet Admiral Nimitz said these words while the fighting still raged. Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue, a sentiment now chiseled in granite at the base of Felix de Weldon's gigantic bronze sculpture of the Suribachi flag raising. 22 Marines, 4 Navy corpsmen, and 1 LCI skipper were awarded the Medal of Honor for utmost bravery during the Battle of Iwo Jima. Half were posthumous awards. General Erskine placed these sacrifices in perspective in remarks made during the dedication of the 3rd Marine Division Cemetery on the embattled island. Victory was never in doubt. Its cost was. What was in doubt in all of our minds was whether there would be any of us left to dedicate our cemetery at the end, or whether the last Marine would die knocking out the last Japanese gunner, above and beyond the call of duty. 27 men received the Congressional Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity during the Battle of Iwo Jima. 22 Marines, 4 Navy corpsmen, and 1 Navy landing craft commander. Exactly half of the awards issued to the Marines and corpsmen of the 5 Amphibious Corps were posthumous. Within a larger institutional context, Iwo Jima represented more than 1/4 of the 80 Medals of Honor awarded Marines during the Second World War. This was Iwo Jima's roll of honor. Corporal Charles J. Berry, 126, 3 March 1945, posthumous. PFC William R. Caddy, 326, 3 March, posthumous. Lieutenant Colonel Justice M. Chambers, 325, 19 to 22 February. Sergeant Darrell S. Cole, 123, 19 February, posthumous. Captain Robert Dunlap, 126, 20 to 21 February. Sergeant Ross F. Gray, 125, 21 February. Sergeant William G. Harrell, 128, 3 March. Lieutenant Rufus G. Herring, U.S. Navy Reserve, LCI 449, 17 February. PFC Douglas T. Jacobson, 323, 26 February. Platoon Sergeant Joseph J. Julian, 127, 9 March, posthumous. PFC James D. LaBelle, 127, 8 March, posthumous. Second Lieutenant John H. Leames, 19, 7 March. PFC Jacqueline H. Lucas, 126, 20 February. First Lieutenant Jack Loomis, 227, 8 March, posthumous. Captain Joseph J. McCarthy, 224, 21 February. First Lieutenant Harry L. Martin, 5th Pioneer Battalion, 26 March, posthumous. Private George Phillips, 228, 14 March, posthumous. PHM 1C Francis J. Pierce, U.S. Navy, 224, 15-16 March. PFC Donald J. Rule, 228, 19-21 February, posthumous. Private Franklin E. Sigler, 226, 14 March. Corporal Tony Stein, 128, 19 February, posthumous. PHM 2C George Whalen, U.S. Navy, 226, 3 March. Gunnery Sergeant William G. Walsh, 327, 27 February, posthumous. Private Wilson D. Watson, 29, 26-27 February. Corporal Herschel W. Williams, 121, 23 February. PHM 3C Jack Williams, U.S. Navy, 328, 3 March, posthumous. PHM 1C John H. Willis, U.S. Navy, 327, 28 February, posthumous. End of Chapter 7 Sidebar, read by Aaron Bennett. End of the Final Campaign, Marines in the Victory on Okinawa, by Joseph H. Alexander.